So I've been looking at the older Final Fantasies for a while now, and I thought to myself, I'm going to play through Final Fantasy V again. Final Fantasy V, for those of you who don't know, is actually my favourite Final Fantasy game in probably the entire series, right there next to Final Fantasy IX, because of the way that it plays, the fact that it doesn't take itself too seriously. And then I realised it's something that I don't ever get to talk about very often, or I certainly never used to, except I want to say in maybe the last year or two, where Final Fantasy V seems to be a much more hot topic than it ever was before. So today I'm going to have a look at why Final Fantasy V might have suddenly seen this surge of popularity, and honestly give myself an excuse to gush about why Final Fantasy V is amazing. Before we get started, of course, though, hello there, beautiful. How are you doing today? My name is Joesephyr. I am a full-time content creator for the Final Fantasy franchise and all things Square Enix. So if you like all things Final Fantasy, then you've come to the right place. Don't forget to check me out on all of my other social media links, including Twitter, Twitch, Discord, and Patreon. On Discord, you can come and join in the conversations about your favourite Final Fantasies. Over on Twitch, I stream 5 days a week, mostly Final Fantasy 14 and the older titles as well. We're currently playing through Final Fantasy 12, and I'm working up my way to play through all of them in one big long marathon, and I'm looking at doing a charity event for the release of Theatrhythm Final Bar Line, which I'm so excited for I cannot even tell you, and there's plenty of other stuff to go along with that too. So if you want to come and find me on Twitch, then please do consider hitting the link in the description box below for that. So I'll tell you what it is that made me want to make this particular video. As a huge fan of Final Fantasy V, and it being one of my favourites in the series, I always found that I never really had anyone to talk to about Final Fantasy V, because a lot of people I knew just hadn't played it simply, or those that had kind of just went, oh, FF4 and 6 are better. Well, I found this poll that had gone around at the end of 2022, and I had a lot of conversations about it because there was some very interesting things that came out of it. This website here is from Twisted Voxel, so big shout outs to them for that. And this game kind of sticks out to me because the top 10 Final Fantasy games in Japan, first of all, let's comment about the fact that Final Fantasy XIV has now overtaken Final Fantasy 7 and 10 as the top charting Final Fantasy there, but that makes sense for a modern audience. It is incredible, and as a Final Fantasy fan, I've told people 100 times why they should play FF14 even if they're not a fan of MMOs. But, interestingly enough, Final Fantasy V is sitting here at number 6. Now, it's behind Final Fantasy VI here at number 4, but it's ahead of Final Fantasy IV. Now, I was always told, certainly growing up, that Final Fantasy V was considered the weakest Final Fantasy of the SNES era. So I was really, curious about why this might be the case, so it led me to want to make this video. And so I went back and I looked at older polls and stuff like that, and I've seen that Final Fantasy V is slowly gaining popularity. And this is even further augmented by the top 20 Final Fantasy characters here, according to Japan as well. So, again, first things first, big shout outs to Emmett Selk there for being the #1 popular character, and I can't say I'm hugely surprised here. Emmett Selk is a phenomenal character. But we also have Bart sitting here at number 15, which I've never seen any Final Fantasy V character in any of these polls, and it just really intrigued me, especially considering that I actually don't think Bartz is the strongest character of Final Fantasy V by quite a long way. Like, you have your Gilgamesh's, Faris, Galoof, Lena. There's loads of characters in 5 that are very popular, certainly Faris, that I was surprised to see Bartz here as well, because, sure, but Final Fantasy V is clearly gaining some popularity, which I found very interesting. But also, I did want to point out, Waka here at number 2 is here for a reason, because I'm sure that those of you who haven't seen this poll before will join me in going, huh? Waka over Cloud and Tifa, etc. There is a reason behind it. It's probably better that you don't know, but if you would like to know more about it, I can release a video on it, because I have researched as to where this comes from, and it's definitely surprising, to say the least. I did also take a look at some reviews over the course of time for Final Fantasy V, and this is an example here by Noisy Pixel, which is a website I love, by the way, and taking a look at the Pixel Remaster, and it definitely, once again, considers Final Fantasy V the weakest entry across the Super Nintendo era. So this one is given 7.5 out of 10, and I don't think that that's very fair to this game, if I'm perfectly honest. Now, I will say that the GBA version of this game is rated slightly higher across the board, normally getting your 80 to 85% marks rather than 70-75%. but that's because it's had more additions added to it that have since been taken back out again for the Pixel Remaster. So there's the 4 new jobs like Cannoneer, etc., that you wouldn't see in the Pixel Remaster that you would in the GBA version. But the cleanliness and the presentation of the Pixel Remaster is still wonderful. So I thought it would be interesting to get a little bit of an impression as to what critics thought of Final Fantasy V as well as the fans. And once again, it does seem like people seem to think that it's the weakest one. When call me a hot take or whatever here, I think it's one of, if not the strongest one. To be honest, I think a big reason that FF5 hasn't seen as much attention, at least in the West, as it has done in Japan, is because we didn't get it for a really long time. So Final Fantasy V was originally released in 1998 over in Japan on the Super Nintendo. But much like Final Fantasy 2 and 3, the West, the US, and Europe didn't get it for ages, which is why in some places when you look at Final Fantasy 4 and 6, as we know it now, they were originally named FF2 and 3 outside of Japan. But the reason that Final Fantasy V wasn't released was very interesting as well. So when looking at translations and interviews from back in the day, the developers of Final Fantasy V felt that it was not accessible to the average Western gamer, which I don't know if that's a read on Western gamers at the time by thinking that perhaps FF5 was too complex for us, but the US didn't get it for 7 years after the original release when it was released as part of the Final Fantasy collection, and the UK and the rest of Europe had to wait even longer to get it. So honestly, it just not being a part of a lot of players' periphery for a really long time may have been a part of it. I of course remember back in the day, after I'd played the GBA version of it, going and playing the Super Nintendo version on an emulator and seeing the Butts was named Butts and everyone thought it was hilarious. So I have fond memories of this game from a very long time ago. Before we continue, I do just want to give a quick shout out over on Patreon, my members only website, where you get all sorts of additional benefits to the channel, as well as early access, title cards made just for you to go into the credits of all my videos, and of course the aforementioned shout out that I do. Now I do a shout out every time I release a video, and today that person is going to be the Captain, who has been a follower of mine for a long time now. A massive thank you goes out to you. And they have Emmett Selk on their title card, the proclaimed most popular character in all of Final Fantasy as according to Japan. So a massive thank you goes out to you and to all of my patrons for your support. It is endlessly appreciated and I couldn't do what I do without you. Now people like to say that they don't love the story for Final Fantasy V as much as many of its peers or the characterizations when compared certainly to FF4 and 6. However, there's a lot of big standout superstars in Final Fantasy V. And Bartz is actually quite low down on the list for me personally. Like, he's your typical kind of harem from the 90s protagonist, like that kind of thing. But let's not forget that Final Fantasy V was the first time we ever saw Gilgamesh, the Wanderer of the Rift himself, and the only character to be conscious of the fact that he's wandering between different games in the same universe. So that's an interesting thing as well. Faris, now I've spoken to a lot of Final Fantasy players, and Faris is extremely popular, especially like when it combined with her sea dragon Sildra, whose cry from right at the start of the game will haunt my dreams like every night to this day. Although I still think that there's more characters beyond that as well that are really entertaining. Lena, the sort of primary female protagonist, is hilarious in a really unintentional way, given that the poor girl seemingly has a death wish every 5 seconds under the guise of being helpful to animals. Now I'll agree, Exdeath is a little bit weak as a villain. He's not the greatest, given that he's a tree, and that's kind of, yeah, ho ho ho, I am the evil guy. That's kind of his entire shtick, and void this, void that. But at least he's like quite a consistent villain as opposed to being a Deus Ex Machina that we've seen previously from the likes of Zeramus, Cloud of Darkness, and characters like that. But honestly, the Saturday morning cartoon style of villain that Exdeath presents kind of is the vibe for a lot of Final Fantasy V. And I think that people love to deep dive a lot of lore when it comes to FF games in particular. When you look, I mean, all you have to do is type in like shipping or anything like that in FF7 and you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. And FF5 doesn't really give you a lot of room to do that. So I wonder if perhaps that is the primary reason that people don't look at FF5 as much as they do the others, despite the fact that it's actually still a pretty phenomenal game. Running along the theme with the whole story kind of feels a bit more tongue-in-cheek and a bit more Saturday morning cartoon. I do also feel, at least from personal experience and having spoken to a large number of Final Fantasy fans, maybe I'll start doing polls and stuff for these kinds of things in the future. Let me know if you'd like to know more from a more statistical point of view. But I think that as we've gotten older, definitely an older fan of Final Fantasy, that kind of thing does come to the forefront, because certainly from my perspective, the gameplay for older Final Fantasies definitely start to come to the forefront more, and the story, you've seen the story. If we've played every Final Fantasy, then we've seen the stories, and a lot of people who are younger are experiencing Final Fantasy 1 to 6 for the first time through, say, the Pixel remasters. Then perhaps the gameplay loop, because it's more succinct and it's more malleable, and a lot more modern games like Bravely Default have drawn from Final Fantasy V, perhaps that's another reason why it sticks out. And for us older players that have seen a lot of the stories as well, it sticks out again because, well, if we've seen FF6, we know what happens in FF6. Yes, it's an incredible game, but does its gameplay supersede that of Final Fantasy V's? And now, and certainly with Final Fantasy IV, I don't think that that's true. I think FF6 definitely continues to stick out, but 4 definitely feels more basic in comparison to the other two SNES titles. So let's talk about that combat system and why it's so popular and why it's so irreverent to this day. Now, it's the primary reason I love Final Fantasy V, and it's probably the main reason that most people love Final Fantasy V, but it's the beauty and the simplicity of the job system. It's just fantastic, and it holds up so well to this day and age because it allows players to tailor-make their characters to whatever they want them to be. It feels like a proper role-playing game. And, Final Fantasy 1 did this, and Final Fantasy 3 did this, but Final Fantasy 5, I'd say, is the first true example of the job system as we know it today. You can take little bits and pieces from one job and apply them to another. You can mix and match, and you get stat boosts and things, and the way that you level them up with AP means there's always something to look forward to as you're playing the game. It's just a brilliant gameplay loop, and because of the malleability and the tailor-made aspects to the party, if you don't want that typical, oh, here's the princess character Lena, better make her a white mage, you don't have to do that. Turn her into a monk and go full Chun-Li realness. Now, I could gush for hours and hours and hours about how much I love the job system in Final Fantasy V. It's elevated so comfortably and pretty considerably as well from Final Fantasy III's job system, which was literally, here's a job, off you go. And, most of the jobs in Final Fantasy III weren't actually very useful apart from for very, very specific encounters. Whereas the combination of the jobs that you have in Final Fantasy V means that almost all of them are useful in some capacity or another. And because of the way that the game is balanced, you can play through the game with pretty much every job there is. I'm going to talk about challenge runs and stuff like that in a moment, but the way that the job system works in this game makes that kind of thing possible, which makes it super popular for those kinds of runs. And like I said, most of them are really useful, except Berserker. We don't talk about Berserker. Blue Mage was introduced in this game, and that is another sort of factor that's been brought in through pretty much every Final Fantasy after it, where blue magic and learning enemy skills has become such a big thing, and it's fun, it's collectible. There's just so many things about the combat system in Final Fantasy V that shine through to this day. I think that one aspect of Final Fantasy V that a lot of the other games don't get quite as much of, at least like this, is support from the community towards challenge runs and the like. So, like I said earlier, the job system in Final Fantasy V is so well made that you can finish Final Fantasy V with any combination of jobs. Literally any, yes, even 4 Berserkers. So, I wanted to turn your attention to 4-Job Fiesta. Not only is FF5 really popular amongst speedrunners and stuff like that, or people wanting to do challenge runs in general, but you have 4-Job Fiesta here as well, which is run by Gilgabot every year. I've done this for the last 2 years, and it actually opened my eyes a lot to challenge runs in general. And it is done to raise money for charity. And basically, you have all of these different hashtags that you can assign to your characters to make it so that you've got specific jobs you have to play with that are randomly generated for you by the Gilgabot Twitter account, so that you have to play in a certain way. And there's so many different versions of the runs that you can play. So you have Team 750, which is basically characters that can have access to rods, because breaking rods in Final Fantasy V is an extremely powerful thing to do in the game. You also get Team No 750, classic, so it plays like FF1, so that the characters are always using jobs from FF1. You know, like the advanced version, natural versions, upgrade versions, forbidden versions, berserker only. Like, if you do this, you are completely like masochistic, because I've gotten berserker multiple times in 4-job Fiesta runs, and it's just horrendous. But yeah, it's just one of these things that I see get so much support from the community that it's just gotten more and more and more popular over the course of time. So do I think that Final Fantasy V is justified in both being underrated for its time and also the fact that it's now seeming to come into its own as a really popular entry in the Final Fantasy franchise? Yeah, to both of them, honestly. Like, the fact that the game didn't come out for a really long time for a Western audience does suggest that a lot of people who may have been interested in it at the time of release simply just never got to play it, because back in the 90s and the early 2000s, people my age or older than me, or even a bit younger than me, would never have had the opportunity to play it. Certainly in Europe, where the first time we got to play it was probably the GBA version. I actually imported the like PS1 version of the game, which is hilariously badly translated. If you're gonna play FF5, I suggest not playing that version of it. But I fell in love with it instantly and was always surprised by the fact that no one else had gotten to play it. And I do think that the fact that the story is a little bit more tongue-in-cheek and a little bit silly, at the time of your FF7, 8, 9, those games, certainly for the time period, like to take themselves very seriously. And I think we are at that point again with games where a lot of games like to take themselves ultra seriously. Look at Final Fantasy 16. I'm not seeing a lot of humour in those trailers so far, but we will wait and see what comes out with the final release of FF16. But I also think that it's wonderful that this game is finally getting some of the attention it deserves, because it really is a fantastic game, even when compared to Final Fantasy 4 and 6. In some ways, I'd say it supersedes them, because the combat system is just balanced so brilliantly that you can make the difficulty as easy or as difficult as you want. If you want it easy, play Blue Mage, just play Blue Mage, at least up until you get mine, and you can play it classic, you can play it off the beaten path. There are reasons to play the Pixel remaster, there's reasons to play the GBA version. There's a lot that goes into Final Fantasy V that I think people, especially thanks to the community support that it's had, are now starting to understand and realise that Final Fantasy V really is up there with the best of them, and it's been my favourite for a long time, for a really good reason. So that's going to be all for today's video. Thank you all very, very much for watching. It was lovely to have you here today. Let me know in the comments below whether you think that Final Fantasy V is one of your favourite Final Fantasies, whether you think that it was woefully underrated at the time of release, or whether you think that it's overrated now, or you think that perhaps you've just not gotten a chance to play it and you would like to try to. Let me know in the comments below what you guys think of that. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and click that bell for notifications on any future videos I might be making. And that's going to be it from me, beautiful, so I shall see you next time. Take care.